Today in the Western world, to be a Christian is often a comfortable and respected choice. Our churches are public landmarks, our beliefs are part of the cultural conversation, and our faith is protected by law. But have you ever wondered what it was really like at the very beginning? Imagine a world where being a Christian was a capital crime, where your beliefs were seen as a threat to the state, where your neighbors whispered that you were a cannibal and an atheist, and where meeting for worship meant risking torture and a brutal death. This was the world of the first Christians under the Roman Empire. Would you have the courage to join them? Would you survive? This is the story of that first generation, a faith that cost everything and because of that changed the world forever. Chapter 1. The World of the Romans, Piety and Power. To understand why the first Christians were so hated, we must first understand the world they entered. The Roman Empire of the first century was above all a religious empire. Roman society was built on a principle called the Pax Deorum, which means the peace of the gods. The Romans believed that the success, stability, and prosperity of their empire depended entirely on maintaining a good relationship with their vast pantheon of gods. Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, and hundreds of other deities were not distant figures. They were active participants in daily life, and they demanded appeasement through specific sacrifices and rituals. Religion was not a private matter. It was a public civic duty. The great festivals, the public games, and even the meetings of the Senate all began with sacrifices to the gods. To refuse to participate in these rituals was not seen as an act of personal conscience. It was seen as an act of treason. It was to endanger the entire community by angering the gods and breaking the Pax Deorum. At the apex of this religious system was the imperial cult. The Roman emperor was not just a political leader. He was a divine figure. He was the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the empire, and after his death he was often officially deified by the Senate. To burn a pinch of incense before a statue of the emperor and declare Caesar is Lord was the ultimate test of loyalty to Rome. It was a simple act, but it was an act of worship, an acknowledgement that the ultimate authority on earth belonged to the state embodied in its divine ruler. This was the world, a world of public piety, civic religion, and emperor worship that the first Christians silently and radically challenged. Chapter 2. The Scandal of Christian Belief. Into this world came a strange new sect, which the Romans initially dismissed as just another bizarre offshoot of Judaism. But they soon realized this new group, the Christians, was something different and far more dangerous. The reasons for their suspicion were rooted in the very core of Christian belief, which was a direct assault on the entire Roman worldview. First, the Romans accused the Christians of atheism. This sounds shocking to us, but it made perfect sense in their world. An atheist was someone who refused to worship the recognized gods of the state. Since Christians refused to offer sacrifices to Jupiter or any of the Roman pantheon, they were, by definition, atheists. This was not a philosophical disagreement. It was a political crime. By refusing to honor the gods, Christians were seen as actively inviting divine wrath and disaster upon the empire. They became convenient scapegoats for every famine, plague, or military defeat. The second-century writer Tertullian noted, "If the Tiber rises as high as the city walls, if the Nile does not send its waters up over the fields, if the heavens give no rain, if there is an earthquake, a famine, a pestilence, straightway the cry is, the Christians to the lion." Second, the Romans were scandalized by Christian exclusivity. The Roman world was syncretistic. They were happy to add new gods to their pantheon. You could worship the Egyptian goddess Isis and the Persian god Mithras, as long as you also paid homage to the Roman gods and the emperor. But the Christians made a claim that was, to the Roman mind, outrageously arrogant. Following the first commandment and the words of Jesus, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me," they insisted their God was the only God. They claimed Jesus, a crucified criminal from a backwater province, was the one and only Lord of the universe, to whom even the emperor owed his allegiance. This was seen as obstinate, antisocial, and deeply insulting. Third, The secrecy of Christian worship led to the spread of the most grotesque and slanderous rumors. Because Christians met in private homes for the breaking of the bread and spoke of eating the flesh and drinking the blood of the Son of God, the Romans accused them of ritual cannibalism. And because they referred to each other as brother and sister and greeted one another with a holy kiss in their secret love feasts or agape meals, they were accused of engaging in incestuous orgies. To the average Roman citizen, the Christian community was a secret society of atheists, cannibals, and degenerates. Chapter 3: The Scandal of the Christian Lifestyle. It wasn't just what Christians believed that set them apart. It was how they lived. The moral life of the first Christians was a profound and often shocking rebuke to the surrounding pagan culture. The Roman world, for all its engineering marvels and philosophical schools, was brutally cruel. The practice of infanticide was common. Unwanted infants, especially girls or those with deformities, were routinely abandoned, a practice known as exposure, left on a hillside or in a public space to die of starvation or to be eaten by wild animals. The Christians, believing that every life was a sacred gift from God, utterly condemned this practice. They would often go to these places of exposure, rescue the abandoned infants and raise them as their own. Roman entertainment was centered on spectacles of death. The gladiatorial games, where men were forced to fight to the death for the amusement of the crowds, were the most popular form of entertainment. Christians refused to attend these games, condemning them as a form of murder. Their radical respect for human life was seen as bizarre and antisocial. Furthermore, the Christian teaching on sexual morality and marriage was a direct challenge to the rampant sexual license of the Roman world. The Church taught that sexual relations were a sacred gift to be reserved for the lifelong faithful covenant of marriage between one man and one woman. It condemned the common practices of adultery, fornication, and homosexuality. But perhaps most shocking of all was the Christian embrace of charity. The Roman world had no institutionalized system for caring for the poor. The sick were often abandoned. But the early Christians, following Christ's command to love one another, created a revolutionary social structure. They took care of their own widows and orphans. They tended to the sick and the dying, even during deadly plagues when Roman officials and physicians were fleeing the cities. This unprecedented and selfless love, extended even to their pagan neighbors, was perhaps the most powerful and baffling witness of the early church. This radical new way of life, a life of exclusive worship, absolute moral convictions, and selfless charity, created a silent but powerful friction with the Roman world. Christians were seen as strange, superstitious, and stubbornly nonconformist. They were a third race, neither Roman nor Jew, a new and unsettling presence within the empire. This social suspicion and popular hatred would soon curdle into something far more terrifying: the organized, violent, and state-sponsored persecution of the followers of Christ. This radical new way of life, a life of exclusive worship, absolute moral convictions, and selfless charity, created a silent but powerful friction with the Roman world. Christians were seen as strange, superstitious, and stubbornly nonconformist. They were a third race, neither Roman nor Jew, a new and unsettling presence within the empire. This social suspicion and popular hatred, fueled by grotesque rumors and a deep misunderstanding of the faith, would soon curdle into something far more terrifying: the organized, violent, and state-sponsored persecution of the followers of Christ. Chapter 4: The Spark, the Great Fire of Rome. The first major state-sponsored persecution erupted in the city of Rome in the year 64 AD, under the infamous Emperor Nero. In July of that year, a catastrophic fire broke out and raged for over a week, destroying a vast portion of the city. The historian Tacitus, a pagan Roman nobleman who was not a friend to Christians, provides a vivid contemporary account of the event in his work, The Annals. He records that a rumor quickly spread through the devastated city that Nero himself had started the fire, perhaps to clear land for his extravagant new palace, the Golden House. Facing the fury of the Roman populace, Nero needed a scapegoat, and he found a perfect one in the small, misunderstood, and already disliked Christian community. They were a fringe group, seen as secretive and hostile to the Roman way of life, making them an easy target for blame. What followed was a spectacle of unimaginable cruelty, a calculated and sadistic outburst of violence designed to satiate the public's demand for vengeance. Tacitus, despite his own contempt for Christians, whom he called a class hated for their abominations, was clearly horrified by the cruelty of their punishment. His historical account is the most important non-Christian source we have for this first persecution. He wrote, "Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired." Nero threw open his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus, while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. This was not a legal proceeding. It was a pogrom, a blood-soaked public relations campaign. It was during this Neronian persecution that, according to ancient and consistent church tradition, the two greatest apostles, St. Peter and St. Paul, met their martyrdom in Rome. Paul, as a Roman citizen, was granted the swifter death of beheading. Peter, in an act of ultimate humility, requested to be crucified upside down, feeling unworthy to die in the same manner as his Lord. The Neronian persecution established a terrifying precedent. The followers of Christ were now enemies of the state, and their faith was a crime for which they could be publicly and brutally executed. Chapter 5. The Legal Status. A Crime to be a Christian. After the chaotic outburst of Nero, the legal status of Christians settled into a strange and precarious reality for the next century and a half. There was no empire-wide systematic hunt for Christians. Instead, the policy was largely reactive. The definitive evidence for this comes from another invaluable non-Christian source, the correspondence between Pliny the Younger, the governor of Bithynia in modern-day Turkey, and the Emperor Trajan. Around the year 112 AD, Pliny wrote to the emperor because he was perplexed. A growing number of people in his province were being accused of being Christians, and he was unsure of the official protocol for dealing with them. In his letter, he outlines the procedure he had been following. He would bring the accused before him and ask them 3 times if they were a Christian. If they persisted in their confession, he saw their stubbornness and inflexible obstinacy as a crime in itself, and he had them executed. For those who denied it, he demanded they prove their recantation by performing an act of worship to the Roman gods, offering incense and wine to a statue of the Emperor Trajan, and as a final test, by cursing the name of Christ, something, Pliny noted, which a genuine Christian cannot be forced to do. Emperor Trajan's reply was brief, but it set the official policy for the empire for over a century. He told Pliny, first, Christians are not to be actively sought out. Second, if they are formally accused and convicted, they must be punished, i.e., executed. Third, if an accused person denies they are a Christian and proves it by worshipping the Roman gods, they are to be pardoned, regardless of past suspicions. And fourth, anonymous accusations are to be disregarded. The implications of this policy were profound. It meant that simply being a Christian, the name itself, as the early writers called it, was a capital offense. A Christian could live in peace for years, but their life was always one disgruntled neighbor, one failed business deal, or one spurned lover away from an accusation, a trial, and a death sentence. To be a Christian was to live with a constant low-level threat of death, to know that at any moment you could be called upon to make the ultimate choice, Caesar or Christ. Chapter 6. The Theology of Martyrdom. This brings us back to the central question: would you survive? Faced with such a choice, a simple pinch of incense to save your life, your family, your future, why did thousands upon thousands of early Christians choose death? To understand this, we must understand that their view of death was radically different from our own. They did not see the martyr as a tragic victim, but as a glorious victor. The very word martyr comes from the Greek word martyria, which means witness. The martyr was the ultimate witness to the truth of the resurrection. Their willing acceptance of death for Christ was the most powerful proof possible that they truly believed in a life beyond this one. Their death was not an end, but a second baptism, a baptism of blood that washed them clean of all sin and guaranteed their immediate entry into the presence of God in heaven. It was the most perfect act of conformity to Christ, a direct and personal participation in his own passion, death, and resurrection. We see this astonishing theology in its most powerful form in the letters of St. Ignatius of Antioch. As he was being transported in chains to Rome to be devoured by wild beasts in the Colosseum, he wrote letters to the various churches. Far from being a man in despair, he was filled with an ecstatic joy. He wrote to the Roman Christians and begged them not to use their influence to save him from his fate. He pleaded with them, "Let me be food for the wild beasts through whom I can reach God. I am God's wheat, and I am being ground by the teeth of wild beasts to be found the pure bread of Christ. Then I will be a true disciple of Jesus Christ." For Ignatius, martyrdom was not a punishment. It was his ordination, his graduation, the glorious consummation of his entire Christian life. This was the supernatural secret of the early church. Their courage was not mere human stoicism or bravery. It was a faith so profound and a hope so certain that it completely transfigured their understanding of suffering and death. They truly believed Christ's words that whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. This was the brutal reality for the first Christians, a world where their faith was a crime, their God was called a fraud, and their death was a public spectacle. And yet the great paradox of history is that the church did not just survive this cruelty, it thrived. The blood of the martyrs, as Tertullian would later write, became the seed of the church. Persecution, intended to stamp out the faith, only seemed to purify and spread it. This raises the ultimate question: how? What was the secret life of this persecuted community? What did they do when they met in secret, in the dead of night, in hidden rooms and underground tombs, that gave them the supernatural courage to face the lions? This was the brutal reality for the first Christians, a world where their faith was a crime, their God was called a fraud, and their death was a public spectacle. And yet the great paradox of history is that the church did not just survive this cruelty, it thrived. The blood of the martyrs, as Tertullian would later write, became the seed of the church. Persecution, intended to stamp out the faith, only seemed to purify and spread it. This raises the ultimate question: how? What was the secret life of this persecuted community? What did they do when they met in secret, in the dead of night, in hidden rooms and underground tombs, that gave them the supernatural courage to face the lions? Chapter 7. The Underground Church. The life in the catacombs. The answer begins in the dark, silent tunnels beneath the city of Rome, the catacombs. These vast underground networks, carved out of the soft volcanic rock, were primarily burial places. Under Roman law, burial sites were considered sacred and inviolable, which granted the Christians a measure of legal protection for their funeral rites. But the catacombs quickly became more than just cemeteries. They became secret sanctuaries, places of refuge where the living could gather to honor the dead and to worship the God who had conquered death. To walk through the catacombs today is to walk through the heart of the early church. And what you find on the walls is not the art of a fearful, death-obsessed cult. It is the art of a people filled with an explosive and joyful hope. While surrounded by death, they painted scenes of life. You see images of Christ as the Good Shepherd, carrying a lost sheep on his shoulders, a symbol of his tender, personal care. You see the story of Jonah and the whale, the most popular image in the catacombs, a clear and powerful symbol of Christ's own death and resurrection. You see paintings of the multiplication of the loaves and fishes and the wedding at Cana, signs that pointed to the supernatural feast they celebrated in these very tunnels. Most powerfully, the catacombs were centered around the tombs of the martyrs. On the anniversary of a martyr's death, what they called their dies natalis, or birthday into heaven, the community would gather at their tomb to celebrate the Eucharist. They were not worshipping the martyr, but they were profoundly connected to them, seeing them as heroes of the faith who were already in the presence of God, interceding for the church still fighting on earth. This was the first expression of the communion of saints. The catacombs were a powerful sign that for the Christian, the line between heaven and earth was incredibly thin. Chapter 8. The source and summit, the breaking of the bread. The art of the catacombs points us to the ultimate source of the early Christians' courage. The secret that gave them the strength to face the lions was not a philosophy or a set of moral rules. It was a meal, It was the Eucharist. In the dead of night, before the sun rose, they would gather for the breaking of the bread. They met in secret, in private homes known as domus ecclesiae, or in the catacombs. To be caught at this gathering meant certain death. So what was so important that they were willing to risk everything for it? We know from sources like the Didache, a Christian text from the late 1st century, and the writings of St. Justin Martyr, that this was the fulfillment of the Lord's command to do this in memory of me. Their worship consisted of 2 parts. First, the liturgy of the word, where they would listen to long readings from the memoirs of the apostles, the Gospels, and the writings of the prophets. The bishop or a priest would then give a homily, explaining the readings and exhorting the community to live a holy life. This was followed by the liturgy of the Eucharist. They would offer bread and wine, and the bishop would offer a great prayer of thanksgiving over them, the Eucharistic prayer, at the end of which the entire community would assent with a thunderous Amen. But for them, this was not a symbolic meal. This was not a mere memorial. They believed, with a unanimous and unwavering faith, that this was the literal, true, and substantial body and blood of the risen Jesus Christ. St. Ignatius of Antioch called it the medicine of immortality. St. Justin Martyr explained it to the emperor by saying, "We have been taught that the food fears both the flesh and the blood of that incarnated Jesus." This was their spiritual food for the journey. They believed that by receiving the resurrected body of their Lord, they were receiving his own divine life into their souls, a life that death could not overcome. This is the secret of their courage. They could face the wild beasts because they had already consumed the lion of the tribe of Judah. Chapter 9, The Bonds of Family, a New Society. This profound vertical communion with Christ in the Eucharist created an equally profound horizontal communion with one another. The early church was not a loose collection of individuals. It was a family. The intense pressure of persecution forged an equally intense bond of love and solidarity within the community. They called each other brother and sister, and they meant it with their entire beings. This was expressed in a radical and unprecedented form of charity. They took Christ's command to love one another as I have loved you, literally. The book of Acts describes the first Christians in Jerusalem holding all their possessions in common. While this was not the universal practice, the spirit of generosity was. The church organized a sophisticated system of social welfare, overseen by the deacons. They took care of their own widows, orphans, the sick, and the poor. During devastating plagues that swept through the Roman Empire, pagan priests and physicians would flee the cities in terror. The Christians, led by their bishops, would stay behind to care not only for their own sick, but for their pagan neighbors as well, often at the cost of their own lives. This tangible, sacrificial love was the most powerful form of evangelization. A pagan world built on power and self-interest had never seen anything like it. And this family had a clear structure. Each local church was led by a bishop who was seen as a spiritual father, the visible sign of unity and the direct successor of the apostles. As St. Ignatius insisted, unity with the bishop was the guarantee of unity with Christ and his church. This structure of authority, community, and radical charity created a new society, an alternative polis within the Roman Empire, a society so loving and so resilient that it could not be destroyed. Final conclusion. We began with a challenging question. Would you survive? Would our modern, often comfortable faith stand up to the cruelty of the 1st century? We have journeyed through the dark history of that era, seeing how the Roman world viewed Christians as strange, subversive, and worthy of death. We have looked into the faces of the martyrs and seen a supernatural courage, born of a theology that saw death not as a defeat, but as the ultimate victory in Christ. And finally, we have uncovered the source of that courage. It was not mere human bravery. It was a supernatural grace that flowed from a life lived in the heart of the Church, a life nourished by the true body and blood of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist, sustained by the loving and sacrificial bonds of the Christian community, and grounded in the hope of the resurrection, a hope they painted on the walls of their tombs. The first Christians survived and ultimately conquered the Roman Empire, not with the weapons of the world, but with the spiritual weapons of faith, hope, and love. Their story is not just a history lesson. It is a challenge to us all, a call to examine the depth of our own convictions and to ask if we are truly living the all-or-nothing faith for which the martyrs died.